All right, hello everyone. So we're going to get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this museum conversation, Winslow Homer and an American Place. This conversation is presented in conjunction with the Palmer Museum of Art's special exhibition, An American Place, selections from the James and Barbara Palmer collection. I'm Alicia Skeef, a graduate assistant at the Palmer Museum, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to this event. We will have a Q&A at the end of our discussion, so if at any time you have a question, feel free to submit it using the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I also want to let you know that we are recording today's program, I believe, and that will be available on the Palmer's YouTube channel at a later date. With that, I would like to now introduce our speaker, Adam Thomas, the Palmer Museum's Curator of American Art. He will be speaking to us today about the 19th century American artist, Winslow Homer, and give us a closer look into Homer's work. So now I'll pass it off to Adam. Adam, if you're ready to begin.
Hi, sorry about that. Technical difficulties, but thank you, Alicia, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. Welcome to this short, focused talk on the artist Winslow Homer, and on, in particular, his painting, Boy Holding Logs. I'm having some issues here. There we go. Boy Holding Logs, there from 1873, this depiction of a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, barefoot, gathering firewood. This modestly sized painting is featured in the exhibition, An American Place, selections from the James and Barbara Palmer bequest, which is on view now at the museum through April 24th. My talk today is part of a series of talks around this exhibition. The first was given by my colleague, Assistant Director Joyce Robinson, who gave an overview, an introduction to the exhibition via Zoom on February 2nd. Joyce will return and be joined by Director Aaron Coe in the last presentation, I believe, around the exhibition on March 30th, discussing the museum's history of collecting American art and about the lasting legacy, in particular, of the Palmer bequest. My remarks today will be just about 30 minutes, I think, and then, as Alicia said, we can open it up for questions. Now, Winslow Homer is an artist who continues to have wide appeal to be studied both by art historians and in museum exhibitions. He's the focal point of what seems like almost an exhibition of a sort of major caliber every year, at least it seems. Just to name a few in recent years, there's David Tatham's book on Homer in England from Syracuse University Press last year. There was Winslow Homer and the Camera, Photography and the Art of Painting, which was an exhibition from Bowdoin College with a catalog from Yale in 2018. And then similar kind of exhibition to David Tatham's book, an exhibition at Worcester Art Museum called Coming Away, Winslow Homer in England, which also had a catalog from Yale University Press in 2017. So those are just a few instances kind of in recent years around this artist. And then I also just show you, for instance, here, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this slide left will open Winslow Homer Cross Currents next month, that is April 2022. an exhibition that perhaps more significantly will travel to the National Gallery in London, making it the first time there's been an overview of Homer's work in the UK. And then also this year, next month too, April, we'll see the publication of William Cross's 500+ page biography published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. It's probably the first kind of proper standalone biography devoted to Homer since 1911, although biography is often a key component in the discussion of much of Homer's work. I can't necessarily vouch for the kind of quality or rewards of these two particular projects, but I do think that they attest to the wide and continued fascination of this compelling figure in the history of art in America. And he's an artist whose work has generated some of the most interpretively rich and forward-thinking scholarship in the field of American art history for decades. Dealing with charged topics of race, politics, humor, environmentalism, the ethics of hunting, among many other topics. To begin, I just want to return to the Palmer's painting, which entered the museum's permanent collection in 2019, making it the only painting by Homer in the collection, although we do have 3 of the many engraved sheets that were produced for, for Harper's Magazine during the 1860s and 1870s. Since its arrival in the museum in 2019, the painting has been refreshed, shall we say, in 2 significant ways. The first was it took on a new frame. In 2020, the Palmer worked with Eli Wilner and Company in New York to fabricate a new frame for it, along with a few other works in the collection. And this was part of a program that they offer, this sort of well-established, somewhat esteemed frame maker in New York City, as part of a program providing matching funds to museums and other cultural institutions. And they created a historically appropriate custom frame for our work by Homer. So far, well, you can see these 4 kind of behind the scenes images, if you will, that show the production of the, I think, elegant fluted cove style frame that Homer's painting is exhibited in the gallery currently. And their studio, here you see the kind of working methods, which uses traditional materials and methods. And this collaboration between the Palmer and Wilner has received some national press coverage. So I just show you this kind of gesso sanding in the upper left, the chasing of ornament in the lower left. And then I think there's that corner, there's kind of this application of this kind of ochre clay that's being applied. And then lastly, this sort of phase of the application of gold leaf there in the lower right. So you just get a sense of the kind of different steps, the sort of attention to detail, the kind of different layers of the material process to craft and create a new frame that's based on an old frame from the 1870s. Of course, when the painting would have been produced by him to create a kind of visually sympathetic and period specific frame. And then the second bit I want to talk about here is that the painting also more recently in September 2021 had the attention of independent conservator Gwen Manthey. She treated the painting during an on-site visit, as you can see from these 2 images, along with a few other works there in the print study room on the 2nd floor of the museum. The painting, the kind of rationale for the painting's treatment was that it was being treated to address an overall kind of layer of hazy synthetic varnish that had obscured the painting underneath it, kind of muting the composition, kind of flattening the depth of field. But then also various discoveries were made in the course of Gwen's examination of the painting. Such things we knew it was kind of painted on panel, but then we also could see how Homer perhaps sort of smoothed down or sanded down the sort of the surface of the support in preparation for making the painting. And then her examination also revealed, ground and paint layers to kind of give a sense of his working process. Homer laid down the composition in this kind of thin paint layer applied in a direct alla prima technique. And, I think the results were quite lovely, quite impressive. Things sort of perked up, if you will. The painting was revealed to be much more variegated. The figure there in the midst of this kind of abundance of nature's changing colors could be much more kind of seen to be a kind of a part of this sort of glow, and all of the different touches, much more vibrant there. I would also just point out that his garment, in particular garments, but in particular the sort of shirt he wears, reads much more as a specific blue rather than as the kind of gray or almost kind of brownish kind of gray in the image of before treatment. And then also quite significantly, I think, and this is kind of what we set out to do, to restore to the original kind of artist's vision here, we get this differentiation much more kind of naturalistically, this differentiation between the foreground space as indicated, say, by the sort of leaves, the upper branches and leaves in the upper right corner, and then this kind of more gradual sort of spatial recession into deep space, whereas the two spaces appear much more kind of flattened before treatment. And then maybe kind of overall, kind of holistically also, you get this kind of great, I think, more harmonious or more kind of striking balance of complementary colors between the blues and the oranges. Lastly, when it comes to the matter of conservation, I just want to say that we also were able to discover and to detect with reflected infrared photography the changes to the position, changes that Homer made in the course of executing the painting, but in particular changes to the cap, the eyes, and the chin, which you can kind of see, I think, in the detail that's pulled out at right. Some of those kind of subtle modifications are slightly detectable in the kind of pentimenti that you see in the finished composition that in some sense maybe give him a more of a kind of tired or forlorn look, I think. But I just kind of want to summarize here that Homer's painting has the distinction of being the only work in the exhibition American Place, indeed one of only a few works in the museum's collection right now that has been both cleaned and reframed in recent years. The painting was acquired by James and Barbara Palmer in 1989 from a dealer, a gallery. And it had long been kind of linked to or paired with the picture that you see at left here, this painting, Girl with a Pail, and thought to be kind of possibly related in some ways. Both paintings are about the same size. They're both on the same wood panel, and they're both these, images of solitary figures closely pushed up to the picture plane. And they're also images that are similar in subject. images of rural labor. As you can see, this painting, Girl with a Pail, is closely related to a work that's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, that Temperance Meeting there, where this milkmaid gives a shepherd a drink of milk or perhaps water there. And they've also kind of long been linked through their history because of the provenance. So both paintings were initially purchased from Winslow Homer's brother Arthur by the same buyer in the late 19th century. And then they both eventually ended up in the Hirshhorn Museum in the 1960s. The Hirshhorn being, well, in Joseph Hirshhorn's collection, which eventually became the Hirshhorn Museum, which is part of the Smithsonian, which today focuses very much on contemporary works of art, which is possibly one of the reasons that the museum deaccessioned Boy with Logs in the 1980s. Before then, the Palmers were able to acquire it. Nonetheless, this kind of coupling, I think, should be called into question to some extent, because no real evidence that Homer sort of viewed them as complementary images. Although they are, very much a part of this group of work that he was making in the early 1970s. It's one of these many works that he dedicated to the activities of children in the 1870s, boys, and somewhat less frequently girls, lounge in meadows or kind of bask, in the warmth of pastures and sunny days, perch in fallen trees, cast fishing poles, whittle, seesaw, chat on wooden fences, build small boats, and this kind of thing. So a youth like that of ours in Boy Holding Log is part of this kind of group of barefoot boys, although in some ways he stands alone. And then now I kind of want to talk about that and sort of try to dig into some of the ways I think that work is maybe to be distinguished from this sort of larger body of work that he was producing in the 1870s. These images like nooning and crossing the pasture of these kind of capped figures or sort of boys at rest, these images that were probably inspired by a kind of appetite for nostalgia and potentially also of the artist's own kind of youth in kind of rural, semi-rural Boston suburbs, Cambridge, and so on, where he was growing up after born there in 1836. So these kind of wholesome, country boys are often kind of read as this, idealization of youth and kind of brotherhood and using kind of the youth and kind of innocence as ways to symbolize, closeness to nature, among other things, but also, closely keyed to the context of post-Civil War America, in which boys or youths generally serve as kind of redemptive symbols, sort of hopeful for the future, hopeful for a country kind of recently going through upheaval through the cataclysm of civil war and strife, and thinking about symbols like in the right of a sort of different context, a more sort of positive, more kind of gleaming context of a country recently sort of torn apart. Here you have this kind of image of two brothers, where brother against brother had often been a sort of narrative in the Civil War, for example. So again, the Palmer picture, sort of in keeping to some extent, I think, with these rural idols of childhood innocence and so on. But Homer, maybe uniquely for an artist of his time, was very much aware or invested in kind of darker currents of the national project, I guess we could say, a kind of mordant sense of humor, keen sense of kind of irony and melancholic notes that animate a lot of his sort of darker pictures. So this is to say that I think, our picture, raises questions about the use of the child's sort of symbolic burden in this sort of new age of the early 1870s. A work like Crossing the Pasture, I mean, sometimes they've kind of been seen to have uneasy expressions. I think some of that kind of moodiness or unease, also kind of permeates the expression of the boy in Boy with Logs here. And there are various ways I think it kind of echoes or comes out of, various themes that Homer was reckoning with for at least the last decade or so, themes of maturity and labor and the end of innocence. Homer, as I said, moved from Boston, where he sort of grew up and was born, to New York in 1959, and then becomes a freelance illustrator, really at the kind of cusp of the Civil War. And then he is a reporter on staff with Harper's Weekly, sent to various Army encampments to kind of document the war, make various sorts of visual records. And he really comes of age as a painter during the Civil War. And he has a sharp eye for detail, spends several tours on the front, and covering the Civil War as an illustrator, in other words. So we get this kind of sense, I think, of he's earning his living in the early days of his career in the 1860s as a war correspondent, kind of witnessing the horrors of battle, repeatedly showing how young men, still boys in some ways, adapted to or kind of resisted the new expectations of them during wartime. So no longer are they kind of dangling in trees or playing in trees, but they're there to conceal themselves, like in this picture, sharpshooter on picket duty, to conceal themselves from the enemy, to get a better vantage point to take their deadly shot. It's not so much about the kind of hide and seek games of boyhood that had prepared them in some sense for these kind of grown-up tasks of sharpshooting, which is just kind of one example of these ways that some of these matters kind of come into play for Homer in an earlier moment, and I think kind of get carried through or are continuing to sort of be reckoned with in the next decade for him. It's also just show you another example of a war picture, one of the kind of early ones that he's making during the Civil War, Punishment for Intoxication. The sort of punishment that would be leveled when you could say, I suppose, levels of maturity that were required for the duties of soldierhood are sort of not met, that there are then behaviors that are sort of punished, such as gambling or drunkenness or whatever. So you see that kind of instance being exacted, this sort of punishment taking place, this almost sort of infantilizing punishment that's going on in a picture that Homer painted on the left. And then, of course, there's this kind of reciprocity of the parallelism that I want to kind of bring to play here, the way, the offender on the left and the boy on the right, are holding these sort of similarly sculptural or kind of static poses, and are also similarly encumbered by the weight on their left shoulders of these sorts of logs. So there's this kind of chain of kind of associations that I think Homer is kind of playing with and trying to understand what it means to be a boy, a man on the cusp of warhood and on the cusp of the nation sort of trying to redefine itself anew in the wake of the war. Again, just to kind of summarize, I suppose, they both kind of occupy these sorts of, liminal positions between childhood and adulthood, between these worlds of juvenile play and the worlds of adult responsibility here. This kind of format of, these kind of threshold spaces where somewhat mysterious solitary figures kind of occupy these shallow zones against a kind of few almost kind of bands of color is also something that made itself felt in his watercolors in the 1870s, watercolor which he took up in the same year he paints Boy Holding Logs, 1873. Again, this kind of main figures in the center of the painting pushed close up to the picture plane is something that we see that's kind of traceable to the Civil War and kind of immediate post-Civil War aftermath in Homer's work, and the way also specifically that the agrarian landscape harbors, more complicated messages. So I think that becomes maybe most clear in a work like Veteran in a New Field here, where he's dealing quite specifically with the aftermath of the war, addressing the problems of the sort of need to heal in some sense, the racial and geopolitical divisions within American society, for example. He finished this painting, Veteran in a New Field, just a few months after the South surrendered and after Lincoln's assassination. And, to some extent, like Boy Holding Logs, it's this sort of starkly simple composition. The former Union soldier has returned to the relative tranquility of agriculture after years of military service. And we see his jacket, his Union Army jacket and canteen there cast aside in the lower right part of the picture. And then, as this picture is often, talked about in, American Art Surveys or wherever, he, deliberately alters the scythe that the man holds there. It's not a modern scythe, but it's an old-fashioned one that's, closely associated with something like the Grim Reaper, that makes the figure himself there in Homer's work a more foreboding figure, and suggests a kind of more profound and kind of melancholic meaning for the picture as well. Ideas about how veterans will return, be reintegrated to American society, and the sort of difficulties which that presents. There's all kinds of other sorts of associations and the kind of issues of the harvest metaphors that abounded during the war that sort of make this picture a kind of special evocation of those associations about kind of death and lost lives that it sort of reminds of as the war sort of intrudes with a kind of subtlety and poignancy in it. Lastly, I just want to maybe bring in this painting, Snap the Whip, from 1872, another work of course, children in rural settings, children at play, a composition that balances this mountainscape with the school building, and then this array of rambunctious characters kind of spilling across the foreground. In the Catskills or Adirondacks, where Homer was painting in the early 1870s, again, these sort of visions of an America reborn after the destruction of war. But this is, again, has been talked about as a kind of somber allegory about, the fragility of human relationships Of course, perhaps the most obvious sort of reference or connotation to the war and to Reconstruction and to slavery is the whip of the title. And this kind of subtlety is very much in keeping with Homer's kind of sense of irony or kind of wry humor or this kind of wry commentary. Of course, the whip being central to wounds that were inflicted, to backs broken, to punishment, to discipline. But nonetheless, it's sort of refigured or kind of recoded here as a game. Again, this sort of, we're getting these sorts of oscillations or interminglings between the serious and the playful that sort of return and are complicated by Homer throughout his kind of career. And then also in the picture Snap the Whip, you get this sort of sense of, if it's kind of read metaphorically in some sense, issues of kind of relatedness and separateness and who gets to be a part of the social body and how are we to sort of join hands, if you will. I would also maybe just in particular note the way the young girls, the left, are detached from the male world, suggesting how divisions and gender roles are learned at an early age, how the women and the girls, even in the games of youth, are already being sort of shut out or sidelined from the male-dominated event here in preparation for adult life. So let's see, in closing, I'll just, again, I guess return to the Palmer picture and maybe say that I think that the boy's sort of stillness and kind of isolation, somber expression present a kind of striking contrast to that, exuberant sort of rambunctious energy that you see in Snap the Whip there, which Homer painted the previous year. And, even if those kind of carefree scamps there, seem to be on the surface quite sort of different in mood. We do see, I think, this kind of through line of the way in which the child and sort of childhood was very multidimensional for an artist like Winslow Homer. So thank you for your attention, and I'll turn it back to Alicia, and she can field and deliver to me any questions that there might be. We probably have time for a couple.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Adam, for presenting that and letting us know more about the painting and related works. So if you have a question, please feel free to submit it using the Q&A feature, and then I will pose it and ask Adam for a response. I guess while we're waiting to see if anyone has a question, I had a particular question, Adam. So you're talking about this kind of liminal positions between juvenile play and adult responsibility, and our painting is of a young boy, and so I'm wondering if that those ideas played into also Homer's paintings of young women and their responsibilities between juvenile play and then becoming a woman.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to maybe tackle that one necessarily, other than to say, young girls and young women appear much less frequently in this kind of playful, carefree kinds of worlds of these rural idols. You do get in the 1870s, a lot of the pictures of the sort of teaching, the sort of school mistress or teacher who seems to occupy maybe a new and kind of growing profession for a new professional class of women or a new occupational pathway. I do think also in regard to kind of the discussion of gender in Homer, don't change. Like this image is often thought by scholars to be a much more kind of celebratory image of the experience of reading, the experience of immersion in text, in the pleasure of literary genre, of the fruits and kind of educational, but also intellectual or kind of entertainment value of books, rather than something sort of superficial or escapist that are taking away from labor or work or something. So in that sense, I think that there's a kind of progressive, maybe is not the right word, but that there's a kind of critical edge to Homer in this watercolor as well.
Okay, great. Thanks. So we actually do have quite a few questions. So our first question is from Anne Rose. She said, thank you. It seems that circa 1900 human figures, at least full-sized and or portrait-like, disappeared from his work. Was that just his adoption of naturalism as a philosophy, or was there more to it?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a kind of easy answer to that question. I do think that maybe, I can think of a lot of sort of significant examples in which the figure is still present, but maybe dwarfed by the forces of nature. And, those works are sort of talked about as the kind of impossibility or difficulty of man or sort of humankind's ability to kind of reckon with or grapple with cosmic powers or fates or what have you. I guess I'm thinking in particular of kind of some of the Maine pictures. He moves to Maine in the early 1880s, about 1883, I believe, and is painting these tumultuous, coastal, craggy, rocky sort of seascape pictures, often without figures. But yeah, I think thinking about that sort of changing role of the figure in his work is an interesting question.
Okay, we also have a question from Sally. In Boy Holding Logs, the boy's position in odd way that he is holding the logs mimics a soldier holding a gun. Could this be another way that Homer ties his Civil War experience to his later paintings?
Yeah, I think that again, I don't know that it's like a literal kind of like one-to-one connection, or that this is something that I want to say is a kind of exact through line or something, but that certain issues that kind of animate some of the early pictures are kind of getting worked through in different ways. And I kind of like that. I think there is this kind of regimented, upright frontal sort of compactness that suggests the kind of, militaristic kind of posture that might, be present from Homer as well. So yeah, I like that. I like that observation.
Our next question is from Jason. He asked, did he paint any scenes of soldiers dying in battle?
Yeah, so, that's one of the things, I guess, about like images of the Civil War generally. It's a lot of kind of campsite scenes, downtime, the kind of aftermath of battle. This was also true of photography on the front lines, beginning with the Civil War in 1861. Photographers like artists were sort of faced with the challenge of documenting these events. And for photography, at least, you're not recording the sort of swift actions of the battlefield because of the need for lengthy exposure times. So you don't really get battlefield photographs with the kind of movement of forces, but rather these sort of before and after sorts of scenes, these kind of peripheries and sort of vestiges that you see. So there's none of what you're referring to in Homer's output that I know of exactly.
Okay, thank you. And our last question is from Susan. She asked, did Homer make notes about his paintings that indicate his thinking about the subjects?
I do believe that there in the Homer studio and elsewhere are some, diaristic type things and letters and kind of documentation, and sometimes making kind of critical responses to or responding to sort of critical responses that appear in the periodical press and so on. But mostly he was pretty kind of cagey and kind of laconic and sort of his own kind of person. So we don't necessarily have a lot of, not a huge outpouring in that regard.
Okay, that looks like that is all the questions. So thank you so much, Adam, for giving this museum conversation and for addressing those questions. I wanted to thank everyone for coming again and attending, and the exhibition, as Adam noted, will be on view until April 24th. So hopefully you can come and see the Winslow Homer painting in person. With that, we're going to end it here, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening.